You're watching Ivory Dang. Today I'll do a walkthrough on how to complete the second project on freeCodeCamp, Responsive Web Design, to build a survey form. So for this project, you're going to create a survey for a user to fill in using HTML and CSS. So for my take on this project, the final product looked like this. Before I do any of these projects, I like to do one full read-through of the instructions, and then on a sheet of paper I map out what's required. This will give me a high-level picture of what I need to do. I'll let you guys pause the video now, take a quick read through the instructions for the project, and then jot down the requirements. So on my brainstorm sheet, it looks something like this. I noted 8 key elements the project wants us to implement, and then so this video will have 2 phases. The first, I will cover how you can complete the project with just the bare minimum coding. And then in the second part, I'll show you guys how to polish up your project by adding some additional instructions to make your survey look more friendly. Okay, so let's get into our project. On the main freeCodeCamp page, under Responsive Web Design Projects, we'll click on Build a Survey Form, which will open up the page of instructions here. We'll scroll to the bottom and we'll click on the CodePen link to open up our project where we will be writing in. So for my survey, I wanted to build a survey form asking the user what kind of Tesla model they wanted. So let's go ahead and go to the first instruction, story 1. It says, I can see a title with ID title in H1 size text. So essentially, the first one just wants us to create a heading with that ID. So what we're going to do is arrow H1 ID equal quotation title quotation arrow, and then let's make this title Tesla model purchase, and then close it with arrow dash H1 arrow. Okay, let's move on to our second instruction. So the second story says, I can see a short explanation with ID description in P-size text. So let's go back to our editor. It essentially, so remember P stands for paragraph. It just wants us to add a description about the page or the survey, and then we'll just add in the ID description. So P, arrow P, ID equal quotation description, quotation arrow, and then our description would be like fill details below to complete your Tesla order, and then arrow slash P, and then arrow. Okay, so let's move back to our instructions and go on to user story 3. I can see a form with ID survey-form. So the project essentially wants us to create our form section and add in the ID survey form. So we're going to arrow form ID equals to quotation survey-form quotation arrow, and then at the very bottom we'll add some spaces, and then at the bottom we'll close it with arrow-form arrow. Okay, so let's move on to user story 4, which says inside the form element I'm required to enter my name in a field with the ID name. So let's go back to our editor, and then between these form lines we'll start to add our content. Inside our form section we'll start to create our inputs. Because the project wants a field where the user can enter in a name, we want to use the input type text. There are many input types such as radio, checkboxes, submit button, email, but for the purpose of user story 4 we will use text. We'll first create the label for the input field. So arrow label 4 equals to quotation and then name, and then arrow, and then our text, which is name, and then we'll close it with arrow dash label arrow, and then we'll create the input field to correspond with that label. So arrow input ID equals to name quotation, and then as mentioned earlier the type will equal quotation text quotation, and then the name attribute equal quotation name quotation, and then we'll add in our placeholder attribute placeholder equal to, so for this one we'll just use Elon Musk, and then the last attribute we want to add is required, and then arrow and then we'll also close it with arrow dash input arrow. So let's discuss a little bit about each of these attributes. So the for and the ID here, the for attribute of the label tag should be equal to the ID attribute of the input element to bind them together. It essentially says this label goes with this input field. So as we can see, name agrees with name. And then our input type is text. This will allow us to essentially write text in the input field. So our name attribute, this is what we want the server to recognize when we submit the value. And then moving on to our placeholder attribute where we put Elon Musk, the placeholder attribute will show an example of the value to display in the input field when it's empty. It provides a brief hint to the user as to what the input is expected to look like in this field. So since our current field is name, we use Elon Musk as an example because he's a famous guy, and people will probably understand, oh, if this is Elon Musk, I should probably put my first and last name. And then at the very end, we put required as an attribute. So this essentially says that if input field is empty, it's not valid. So there has to be a value in that input field. And then the next thing we're going to do is just add a space. So arrow BR arrow, so that will allow us to enter into the next line. Okay, so let's move back to the instructions and move on to user story 5. So it says inside the form element, I'm required to enter an email in a field with ID email. Okay. So user story 5 wants us to create an email input field. So we will create our label again, arrow label 4, and then equal sign quotation email quotation, and then email, and then we'll type out text, which is email, and then we'll close it with arrow dash label arrow. So now we'll create the input that correlates with this label, which will be arrow input ID equals to quotation email quotation, and then the type we can use email, so quotation email quotation, and then the name equal sign quotation email quotation, and then remember we'll also add a placeholder to show a hint in the empty input field. So then this could be equal sign quotation Elon Musk at tesla.com, and then quotation, and then remember we also want to add in the required attribute to make sure that the user fills in this input field, otherwise it's not valid. Essentially it's kind of like a nice reminder to make sure that the survey form is complete. And then arrow, and then arrow dash input to close it, and then a BR arrow BR arrow to enter into the next line. Let's move on to our next instruction. So user story 6 says, if I enter an email that is not formatted correctly, I will see an HTML5 validation error. So we accomplished this earlier by adding that required attribute at the very end of the input element. This required attribute also makes it so that only validly formed email addresses are allowed. Let's move on to our next instruction. So in user story 7 says inside the form I can enter a number in a field with an ID number. So in user story 7 it just wants us to create an input field where we can enter a number. So let's make this input field equal to number. So let's first create our label. Arrow label 4 equals to quotation number quotation arrow, and then we'll use age since it's a nice example of a number. So then we'll close with arrow dash label and then arrow, and then we'll create a corresponding input with that label. So input ID equals to quotation number quotation. Our type equal to quotation will be number quotation, and then the name attribute equals to quotation number quotation, and then our placeholder to give a hint to the user, like that grayed out text as an example of what they should put in that input field. So equal to quotation, we'll use the age 18 and then quotation, and then remember to add our required element to make sure that they do fill out that input field, and then arrow, and then close it with arrow dash input arrow. So let's add our BR so that we can enter into the next line, and then let's go to our next set of instructions. So in user story, it says if I enter non-numbers in the numbers input, I will see the HTML validation error. So we accomplish this by adding that required attribute earlier in our input element. So that is done. So moving on to user story 9. It says if I enter numbers outside the range of the number input, which are defined by the min and max attributes, I will see an HTML validation error. So for user story 9, it just wants us to create a range limitation. So we're going to go back into our number input element, and we're just going to add in our min attribute. So min equals to quotation, well, let's say the age of 18 and then quotation, and then we'll do a max equal to quotation an age of 100 and then quotation. Let's go back to our instructions and then move on to user story 10, which says for the name, email, and number input fields inside the form, I can see a corresponding labels that describe the purpose of each field with the following IDs. ID name label, ID email label, and then ID number label. So we're just going to go back to our previous inputs and essentially add in that ID attributes for each of those labels. So we'll start with the name. So going back into that name element, space, and then ID equals to quotation name dash label and then quotation. And then we'll move on to our next label, which was the email one. We'll do space and then ID equals to quotation email dash label and then quotation. And then we'll move on to our number label. So then we'll add in ID equals to quotation number dash label and then quotation, and that should solve user story 10. Let's move on to our next set of instructions. User story 11 says for the name, email, and the number input fields, I can see a placeholder text that gives me a description or instructions for each of those fields. So we accomplished this already in the previous steps when we added our placeholder attributes in our input elements, as you can see here. In the first one we put Elon Musk, and then for the second one we just made up an email for Elon Musk, and then third we put in 18 as an example age. Let's go back to instructions and move on to our next story. So for story 12, it says inside the form element I can select an option from a drop-down that has corresponding ID equals to drop-down. So the project wants us to create a drop-down list that we can select from. So for this survey, let's create a drop-down list of the available Tesla models that the user can select. So we'll first create our label. So arrow label 4 equals to quotation drop-down quotation, and then ID equals to quotation model, and then arrow, and then we'll type out text, select model, and then close it with arrow dash label arrow, and then we can implement our drop-down element, which is select ID. So arrow select ID equals to quotation drop-down quotation arrow, and then we'll enter a couple lines, and then at the bottom we have to remember to close it. So arrow dash select arrow, and then in between these select lines we can start filling in the drop-down list of the items we want to show. So we can do that by using the option value element. So arrow option value equals to quotation model S, and then quotation, and then arrow, and then we'll add our text, which is model S, and then close it with arrow dash option arrow, and then we'll add our second item, option value oh, a quick way to do this is we'll just Control C, copy this, and then paste it. So we'll do one more. So there's the Model S, there's also the Model 3, and then the Model X, and then the next one's Model Y. And then the last one is the Cybertruck. And the way I was able to remember it was, like, if you look at the acronyms, it stands for sexy. So that was kind of clever. That was kind of clever of Elon Musk to do that. Cybertruck, and then this is Cyber. So the text is Cybertruck, but remember for values, it's better etiquette to add underscores rather than the spaces. So let me just go back and adjust those. Okay, we'll add 2 line spacing. So arrow BR arrow, and then arrow BR arrow, and then we'll go to our next set of instructions. So in user story 13, it says inside the form element I can select a field from one or more groups of radio buttons. Each group should be grouped using the name attribute. So if you guys can recall, the radio element is essentially those circular things where you can click and select one. So for our radio element for this survey, let's make it the car color. So black, white, and red, and then the user can select one of those colors. So we'll first create our label. Arrow label 4, and then equal to quotation model underscore color, and then our ID equal to quotation model underscore color quotation arrow, and then our text, so model color, and then colon, and then we can close it with arrow dash label arrow. Let's make this bold by doing arrow B arrow, and then close it with arrow dash B arrow at the end of the text. Okay, so let's start creating our inputs, which are those circular dot things that the user can select. So we'll do arrow input ID equals to, let's make the first one black, equals to quotation model underscore color quotation, and then type will be equal to quotation radio quotation, and then our ID will be equal to quotation black quotation name, attribute equals to quotation color quotation, and then our value equals to quotation black quotation, and then arrow. And then our label, we should have a label that corresponds to that input that appears essentially beside the circular dot thing. Label 4 equals to quotation model underscore color, and then quotation, and then arrow, and then our text, which is black, and then we'll close it with label. So arrow dash label arrow. So just remember, our label ID model color will agree with our label 4, which is model color. Essentially says that these two elements are binding together. They correlate, they correspond with each other. So let's do our next 2 colors. So we'll just Control C this, and then Control V, and then Control V to paste it. Let's add a line spacing in between. So arrow BR arrow, and then arrow BR arrow, and then we'll just change the color inside the input elements. So our second one will be white. So we'll just change any text that had black to white, and then the third one is red. So we'll change anything that had black to red. add BR up here to push that radio button down. That way it just vertically aligns. And then we'll add 2 more line spacing after the radio element. Okay, let's move on to our next instruction. So user story 14 says, inside the form element, I can select several fields from a series of checkboxes, each of which must have a value attribute. So the project now wants us to add a list of checkboxes. So for our survey, maybe we can add a list of features that maybe the user can check if they want additional features to their Tesla model. We'll first create a label, arrow label for, and then equal to quotation features, and then quotation, and then arrow, and then we'll add our text, add features, colon, and then equal to arrow dash, and then label arrow to close it. And then let's make our add features text bold. So we'll at the beginning of the text we'll do arrow B arrow, and then at the end of the text we'll do we'll close it with arrow dash B arrow, and that should make it bold. Okay, and then we'll add a line spacing, so arrow BR arrow, and then we'll start creating our checkboxes. So we'll do arrow input ID equals to checkbox quotation, and then our type equals to quotation checkbox. So type attribute will give us that appearance of the checkbox, and then the name attribute equals to quotation features quotation, and then our value equals to quotation. So let's make the first feature related to autopilot. So we'll do autopilot, and then quotation, and then arrow. And then now we want to, now that creates the circular, or that creates the checkbox, but now we also have to create a label corresponding with that input. So arrow label for equals to quotation checkbox quotation arrow, and then we'll type in our text full self-driving autopilot, and then dash, let's make it $10,000 for this feature, and then we'll close it with arrow dash label arrow, and then add in arrow BR arrow to enter line spacing. So what we can do is we can just copy this and then paste it 2 times to add in 2 more checkboxes. However, now we'll just change up the text to make the features into something different. So for the second feature, let's make it dual underscore motor, and then change the text. So dual motor all-wheel drive, and then let's make this $9,000. And then for the third one, let's make this feature battery. So we'll change the text to performance plus enhanced battery. And then let's make this $7,500. Okay, so now we have 3 additional features that the user can choose to add on onto their Tesla model. Let's move on to the next set of instructions. So user story 15 says, inside the form element, I'm presented with a text area at the end for additional comments. So item 15 wants us to create a text box where the user can type in additional comments if they wanted to. So we'll first start with the label. So arrow, label ID equals to quotation, text area quotation, and then arrow, and then the text additional comments, and then we'll close it with arrow dash label arrow, and then we will now implement the text box element. But first, let's create a line spacing. So arrow, br arrow, and then arrow text area ID equals to quotation text area quotation, and then name equals to quotation instructions quotation, and then we want to define the width and the height of the text box. So to define the height, we'll use rows equals to 5, which is essentially 5 line spacings, and then columns, or it's just COLS equals to quotation, let's do 40, and then quotation, and then arrow. And then we'll close it with arrow dash text area, and then arrow. And then we'll add a line spacing, arrow, br, arrow. So if we scroll down, we can see that this has given us a text box. You know what? Let's add another line spacing between the add features and the additional comments. So let's go back up here, and then we'll add one more br. Okay, let's move on to our next set of instructions. So in user story 16, it says inside the form element, I am presented with a button with ID equals to submit all my inputs. So the next item we're going to add is a submit button. So all we're going to do is arrow input ID equals to submit, and then the type equals to submit. So this type where it equals to submit will give us that button, and then if we scroll down, we can see it's right now it says submit query, but like if we wanted to change the text within that box, we can add the attribute value and then equals to quotation. Let's make that text called place order quotation, because the user essentially for the survey wants to order a Tesla model car. And then if we click our run test, we essentially completed all steps. So let's move on to our second phase on how we can make this survey look more friendlier to the user. Do 6 things to polish up our current survey. First is to apply organization to our HTML. Second is to update our font and background color. Third is to align our content. Fourth is to add a layover. Fifth is to format our submission button. And then 6th is to format our input fields. So let's go ahead and organize our HTML. So first thing we can do is identify the document, or the document type for this HTML. So arrow exclamation mark doc type HTML arrow, and then we'll do arrow HTML arrow, and then at the very bottom we'll close it as well. So arrow dash HTML arrow. So this essentially just indicates that this script that we wrote is primarily HTML. And then next thing we can do is we can apply our header and our body. So right above H1 we'll do arrow header arrow, and then below H1 we'll close it, so arrow dash header arrow. And then right above P we can use this as the beginning of our body, so we'll do arrow body and then arrow, and then we'll scroll all the way to the bottom, and just right before HTML we can close it off as body, arrow dash body arrow. The second step to polishing up our survey is updating the font and the background color. We can just go to Google Fonts, and I happen to pick Poppins because it looks like a techish font, like something that Tesla would use. So if we just click select the style, it expands a bar to the side, and then if we click embed and then click add import, we'll just highlight and copy this link, Control C, and then we'll go back to CSS, we'll paste this link. So this only provides the source, so it hasn't updated or changed the font yet. To do that, we're going to write instructions for our body to refer to the source. So we'll type body bracket, and then font dash family colon hyphen poppins, and then hyphen, and then semicolon. So you can see that poppins here refers to the font family poppins from that link that we just pasted in. So next thing I want to do is I want to indicate how much space I want between my text. So we can do that by typing in line dash height colon, let's do 1.4, and then semicolon to end it. And then let's now update our background color. So let's type in background dash color colon, and then I just googled Tesla's color scheme. So I picked one of the gray colors, the D7DD here. So let's type that in, or just paste it. And as you can see, that added that gray to our background. And the next thing we can do is we can specify the width of our the survey of which our input fields are in. So let's do width and then colon 500 px, and then semicolon, and then let's move our content to the center of the page. And one way we can do that is type in margin colon, and then auto, and then semicolon, and then make sure you close it with a bracket. So we just finished aligning our content to the center. So the fourth thing we can do is add a layover, and to do that we can type out form bracket, and the form in CSS refers back to our form element with an HTML here. So whatever formatting instructions we write in CSS is going to change the appearance of that form element that we have. So in this bracket, we'll first write background colon, and then we'll use RGB. So you can Google up RGB colors on Google, and I happen to select a red one, which is 147. So RGB stands for red, green, blue, and then the fourth attribute can be the opacity. So our red will be a high number, 147, and then our green will be a low number, 5, and then blue will be low as well, 5, and then our opacity, let's do 0.2, and then we can end it with semicolon. Okay, so the next thing we can do is add padding. So padding is just the space in between your content to the border. So let's do 2.5 rem. So that is the vertical, and let's now do the horizontal, 2.5 rem as well, and semicolon. So that just added more cushion, more space in between our content and the border. And then the next thing we can do is round out our border edges. So we can type out border dash radius colon 2 rem, and then semicolon. And then now let's define our width. So width 500 px semicolon, and then margin colon auto semicolon, and then make sure it's closed off with a bracket. Okay, so the fifth thing that we can do is to format our submit button. Right now our submit button, if we scroll down, is this grayish small button at the bottom. However, we want to make that button more distinguishable so that it's easier for the user to spot, as well as the user will feel more inclined to click it. And to do that, we can first go to our input submit element, and at the very end we can add the attribute class equals to submit dash button. And then if we go over to CSS and we start with period submit dash button and then bracket, whatever formatting instructions that we write in CSS, this will apply to that reference we just created, the class reference we created for the input submit element. So let's first define our width. So let me just scroll to the bottom so you can see the button changing as we write the instructions. So width colon, let's do 100%, and then semicolon. So this is 100% of that 500 px up here, or up here, that we wrote earlier. And then let's add some spacing. So padding colon 0.75 rem semicolon to end, background color, so background, and then colon, let's make it red, and then semicolon to end, and then color of the font, which is color colon, and then white semicolon to end, and then border radius to round out the edges, colon, so let's do 2 px, and then semicolon, and then last thing is cursor, is how your cursor will appear when it hovers over the button. So let's do pointer, and then semicolon, and then as you can see, it's the button is much more bigger and much more noticeable. The final step in polishing up our survey is to format our input headings and our input fields. So let's first format our input headings. And to do that, let's first create a div class reference applied to our form. So if we scroll all the way up and right below the form element, let's create our div class reference. So arrow div class equals to quotation. Let's do input dash headings, and then quotation, and then arrow, and then we shouldn't forget to close that. So let's scroll all the way back to the bottom, and right before the form closer, let's do arrow dash div and then arrow. So this will close out that div, and everything between div will change according to what CSS instructions we write over in the CSS column. So let's make the reference to our div class that we just made. So it was called input headings. So we start with period and then input dash headings and then bracket, and then let's define the margin. So margin colon, and then let's do 0 auto 1.25 rem, and then auto, and then semicolon, and then padding colon 0.25 rem, and then semicolon. And just for a quick review, for the margin instruction, it goes clockwise. So 0 is top, auto will be right, and then 1.25 rem is the bottom, and then auto is to the left. So the last thing for us to do is to format our input fields, and to do this we can apply the same strategy that we use for input headings. So what we're going to do is create class references in the input elements in HTML, and then make reference to that using CSS to change the appearance. So let's go to our first input element, which was name, and then right before the required attribute, let's create the class reference. So type in class equals to quotation, and then let's do form dash inputs, and then quotation, and then space, and then we'll just highlight and copy this, and then let's move on to our next input element, which was email. So same thing again, right before required, just Control V and paste, and then let's move on to our next input element, which was the number. So right before required, just Control V, paste, and then the next one is select model. So right in the select ID element at the very end before the arrow, Control V, paste. So now we created the class reference, and now we can start formatting the appearance of these input fields. So in CSS, let's start with period and then form dash inputs bracket, and then start writing our instructions. So let's start with display colon and then block semicolon, and then width colon, let's do 90%, and then semicolon, let's define our height colon, let's do 2 rem, and then semicolon, and then padding colon, let's do 0.25 rem, and then 0.75 rem, and then semicolon, and then let's do background dash color colon, and then hashtag FFF semicolon and then border colon 1px solid, and then let's copy hex color, and then we just control V and then end with semicolon, and then let's round out our edges, so border dash radius colon and then 0.25 rem and then semicolon, and then make sure you close it with a bracket. So that essentially completes our project. So if I just change the view to this, that is what essentially our survey looks like. So we can type in our name here, we can type in the email, type in the age, select your model. Me preferably, I would pick the Cybertruck, and then we can click on one of these model colors. I would go with red, and then of course I would select all the features. And just to verify that this project is complete, we can copy the link up here, and then we'll go back to the instruction page, and then Control V here to paste, and then if you click submit, that should do it. That should get you ready for the next project. Again, if you guys found this video helpful, please remember to give a like and subscribe. I'll provide you guys with the link to freeCodeCamp and the CodePen editor in the video description below. I will also provide you guys my HTML and CSS project coding for your reference. So yeah, thank you again for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next video.